Hello, everyone. My name is Laila Abdelaziz, and I'm a Privacy and Data Policy Manager at the Center for Information Policy Leadership, based out of the Washington, D.C. office. I am very excited to be joined today by Deputy Commissioner Liz MacPherson from New Zealand, from the Office of the Privacy Commissioner. Welcome, Commissioner. How are you?
I'm very well. Kia ora koutou, everyone.
Thank you so much for being with us today. Really looking forward to talking about a new draft rule issued by the Office of Privacy Commissioner related to biometric information in New Zealand, specifically the processing of biometric information. But before we get into that, I would love to hear more about you, Commissioner, and how you ended up at the OPC.
Right. Well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this. It's great to meet you, Laila, and to be able to have a chat with the CIPL membership. So I'm Liz MacPherson, as you said. I'm the Deputy Privacy Commissioner here at the Office of the Privacy Commissioner in New Zealand. My journey here, I've been here for 4 years now. I joined during the first week of our COVID lockdown in New Zealand. So that was an interesting time to join a new organisation. My previous background, prior to coming to the offices, I was the what would be the equivalent in the States of the chief statistician. I was the head of Statistics New Zealand, our statistics organisation and data organisation in New Zealand, for about 6 years. Prior to that, I've had a variety of different roles across government, economic policy, labour market policy, research and statistics, a variety of different things, basically working in and around the government for around 30 mumble years. So yes, so that's me. I'm loving being here. One of the things I find fascinating is the way in which it brings together my career in data and statistics and interest in public policy and regulation, and now the use of personal information and how we protect that.
And I'm sure your joining during the lockdown really brought a lot of these issues to the forefront about, why they're more important now than ever to tackle.
Absolutely, absolutely. There's nothing like joining a new organization from your front room via digital technology and having to think through all of the different protections that need to be in place to work remotely. And to also see all of the things that happened during COVID with respect to the various different types of use of data. And that was a really big focus for us at OPC over that period of time, working with the government to ensure that data could be used safely for the benefit of New Zealanders during a real health crisis.
Thank you. Thanks for sharing that, and thank you for your service to the public good. Turning to the current consultation that your office is working on, the Privacy Act, the New Zealand Privacy Act allows the Commissioner's Office to issue codes of practice that kind of help illuminate or expand the understanding or the requirements related to covered information in the Act. And one of those pieces of covered information is biometric information. And the Commissioner's Office currently has a consultation open, I think, open to hearing from the public until May 8th of this year,
right,
if I'm correct. I really have to commend you and your office on this consultation process. I just loved the landing page, the context, all the easy digestible information that you made available. I think that really helps make this information accessible, not just to the public, but to small, medium, large organizations that are really important in many of our daily lives and in providing us services. So congratulations on what has been a multi-year process, but I would love to hear more about kind of how the OPC arrived to this point, to these draft rules.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you very much. I'll actually accept those plaudits on behalf of the team that did all that work. The one thing I would like to say, Laila, first of all, about our codes in New Zealand is that they're a bit different from other codes. They effectively modify the law and have the force of law when they are promulgated by the Privacy Commissioner. So they can essentially modify our core privacy principles, and the privacy legislation in New Zealand is a principles-based piece of legislation. The core of it are a set of 13 principles, which cover the things that you'd expect from across the information life cycle, from collection through authorization, use, disclosure, storage, security, all of those sorts of things. The code can basically heighten the standards or reduce the standards for those particular principles. So unlike some other codes, which, as you say, illuminate, this actually has the force of law, and when it is promulgated would have associated guidance. So that's just a little bit about our particular type of code. In terms of our process, as you say, we started with a position paper back in 2021, and the reason we put the position paper out was that we were hearing from across New Zealand that there were concerns about biometrics, but that biometrics were not regulated. There was nobody who regulated biometrics. And so that initial position paper was very much focused on the fact that biometrics are personal information, and that personal information is regulated by the Privacy Act. So essentially saying, there is a sheriff in town, and it's the Office of the Privacy Commissioner. We also, in that position paper, made fairly clear that we had some expectations about the way in which people collected and used biometric information. Then in 2022, we went out in a public consultation off the back of that position paper to say, is further regulation needed? Do we need something beyond simply an expectation, a statement of the expectations of the Privacy Commissioner in the position paper? And the feedback we got was, yes, we think that there is the need for further regulation. There was a fairly balanced view between whether that needed to be a code or whether it needed to be more guidance material. On balance, having looked at the feedback and done our own research, we decided that, an analysis, we decided that we would focus on the potential for a code. So in 2023, we did some targeted consultation, which essentially said, here is a broad sweep of proposals that could be included in a code, in a biometrics code of practice, and tested that. Off the back of that targeted consultation, we have now narrowed that the proposals down to what is in the current exposure draft code. Our approach here in New Zealand in terms of issuing these codes of practice is that we have to go through a statutory consultation once the Privacy Commissioner has decided that there will be a code. And so we've actually put this additional step in place of the exposure draft code. As you say, it's out for consultation until the 8th of May. And once we've heard back from people, had an opportunity to consider that feedback, the Privacy Commissioner will then make the final decision whether to go for the code or not. And then that very final draft will go out for statutory consultation before it's promulgated. So it's a very consultative process, and needs to be, because, as I've said, this code has the force of law.
Yeah, that's thank you so much for breaking that down. And interestingly, this code is called the Biometric Processing Privacy Code.
That's right.
Can you tell us more about that? What is the intent with what kind of conduct this code will target in organizations?
So it's deliberately targeting the use of biometric technologies for automated processing. In terms of it doesn't pick up on manual processing. So, for example, if you have digital photographs and you are you're not using an automated biometric process to analyze that information, you would not be picked up in this code. However, if you decided at some point in the future to apply biometric processing techniques to those digital photographs, then they would be picked up.
Okay. And how does the code define biometric information? Other jurisdictions use biometric data, but New Zealand uses the word information, so just could be synonymously understood. But yeah, I'd love to learn how the code understands what biometric information is.
So we use the term biometric information largely for consistency purposes with our own law, because for example, because we refer to personal information in our Privacy Act and another one of our codes, for example, which is the Health Information Code, also refers to information. So it's I think you just think about it as being biometric information, biometric data. But in terms of what's covered there, we have included within biometric information three main things, or you could describe them as two. The most jurisdictions overseas focus largely on the use of biometric for recognition purposes, so either identification or verification. So yes, we pick up those 2 points. So biometric processing for those two uses, but we also include within our scope biometric classification. So the use of biometrics for inference purposes, for categorizing people into groups. And we've really picked up on this because we see it as an emerging use. And our intention is that this biometric processing code will be useful into the future. So we're really focusing on emerging uses. And I was really interested to see that a recent publication by the Turing Institute in March of this year also basically is focused in that area. So they've basically said, look, most biometric technology systems focus on identifying an individual or verifying their identity, but their view is that definition is outdated and doesn't account for the full range of biometric-based systems that are now available or becoming available. So that particular report argues for essentially what we've done here, which is to account for the emergence of new inferential and classification biometric-based systems, such as ones that are capable of age estimation, claim to be capable of emotion recognition, and demographic-based categorization.
That's great to know. So what I'm hearing is basically, well, most jurisdictions are targeting biometric identification, which basically tells someone who someone is, or biometric verification, which helps confirm to an organization whether someone is who they say they are. The New Zealand code is also targeting biometric classification, which, as you said, could, it's not necessarily telling, is this Laila or is this Liz? It's saying this is a woman, or this is a person that's above a certain age or below a certain age, or, those kinds of things. That's biometric classification.
Yes, yes, but it's what we're saying is that type of analysis could actually say, and combined with some of the other approaches, could say, this is Laila. Laila is of this age. Laila, we are inferring that Laila is happy because we're having a look at her face. It could potentially infer health status. There's a variety of different things that could happen there. So we're saying that is personal information. It is information about you.
Got it. Got it. And then the code also leaves some certain things that other jurisdictions include in their definition of biometric data, but it leaves them out of this definition. And the main one that comes to mind for me is DNA. So like, I think DNA, and I don't know if the code treats it differently, but I also saw that, for example, devices that monitor your heartbeat, for example, would also be outside the scope of biometric information. Is that correct?
Yes, I mean these are so in terms of DNA, this is one of the things that we've excluded from day one, and the reason for this, so that's what we describe as biological biometrics, so genetic, brain, neurological system material. This is not because it isn't biometric information, but because we believe that it actually requires its own special treatment. And we think in New Zealand we have legislation in New Zealand that deals with DNA and the collection of DNA and biometric samples, which our law commission here has said needs to be updated, and we're of the same view. So we think that this information needs its own special treatment. It's not that it isn't biometric information, it's just we've excluded it from the coverage of our code.
Got it. Got it. And then who does this code target? What kinds of organizations?
Well, in New Zealand, the Privacy Act in New Zealand covers pretty much the entire economy. So public and private organizations. There are very few organizations that aren't picked up by the Privacy Act. However, we have said that with respect to the coverage of this code, we have, as I said earlier, a parallel and pre-existing code, the Health Information Privacy Code, which covers health agencies. And what we're effectively saying is that if you're covered by the Health Information Privacy Code, then you're excluded from the Biometrics Code, because a lot of the requirements that are in the code would already apply to you, or there's basically a higher standard that already applies to health agencies who are covered by the Health Information Privacy Code. What we will be doing once we've concluded this process with the Biometrics Code of Practice is to swing back round and have another look at our Health Information Privacy Code and see whether it needs to be updated to align it further with the Biometric Code of Practice.
Got it. Thanks for that. Now moving on to the compliance requirements in the code, there is a new major introduction here, which, as I understand it, in a lot of other jurisdictions around the world, there's something called the Privacy Impact Assessment, which helps organizations balance the benefits and risks associated with certain processing activities. And that is a best practice in New Zealand currently. But under this code, there would be a new requirement, like a baseline requirement, that organizations conduct a proportionality assessment. My understanding is before deployment of biometric systems. Is that correct?
That's right. That's right. So as you say, in New Zealand, our Privacy Act in New Zealand doesn't require people to do privacy impact assessments, but they are seen as best practice. And certainly if we were going in and having a look at an organisation from a compliance perspective, and we wanted to see some demonstration that they had taken a disciplined and considered approach to their collection and use of personal information, we would be expecting to see a privacy impact assessment had been done. But the proportionality assessment is, we're putting this in place as what we describe as Rule 1 in the code, to sit alongside our Principle 1, which is about the collection of personal information. And the Privacy Act the Privacy Act says that when you're collecting personal information, you have to have a good purpose for doing that, that is connected with the organisation's purpose, and that the collection has to be necessary for that purpose. What we're doing is that in addition to only collecting necessary information for a lawful purpose, Rule 1 will basically say that the organisation must not collect biometric information for biometric processing unless they believe that on reasonable grounds that the biometric processing is proportionate in the circumstances. So they need to have gone through a balancing. They need to have thought about the benefits and the risks. And that needs to happen, as you said, before you take this, you start using, before you take this to market. And to help with that, we've basically written into the code 6 factors that we expect the organisation to have considered when running a proportionality test.
And one of those
Do you like me?
considerations really jumped out at me and I thought was very thoughtful and important, but maybe a new one for a lot of privacy professionals outside of New Zealand. One of those considerations is to take into account the cultural impacts and effects of the biometric processing on the Maori community. I'd love to learn more about this, and also, like, how can an organization approach that that requirement, and how can it, are there other similar requirements in New Zealand law that would help illuminate that requirement?
Yes, so in terms of those 6 factors, we do require must consider the cultural impacts or the effects on Māori. So for those, for your listeners, the Māori people of New Zealand are the Indigenous people of New Zealand, and for Māori, the biometric information, for all of us, biometric information is more than just being about us, it is us. But for Māori, it's even more important. And for other cultural groups, there will be something similar. But for Māori, the face, the person is tapu, it's sacred information. It can tell you something about the person's whakapapa, which is their heritage, their genealogy. So it connects that person with those past and those present and those in the future. For some Māori have facial tattoos, women on their chins, Māori men on their faces, and those tattoos themselves have been gifted to that individual. They are very sacred and have particular meanings, again, often linked to genealogy. And so for that perspective, it's important to take those things into consideration. That is personal information. So your question was, is cultural assessment something that is common in New Zealand? It's become more commonplace. But I guess what it comes back to is, if you are going to put in place, if you're going to collect biometric information, you need to make sure that you understand what the impact is going to be on your community of interest, on your customers, on the citizens that are using your services, and to think about how you might put in place some, whether you actually go ahead with this or not, or whether there are some mitigations that can be put in place that might actually prevent some of those risks from taking place. In New Zealand, we will be, like as with all of our codes, we will have some guidance material associated with the code. And in the case of this particular requirement for cultural impact assessment, there will be guidance material, and that guidance material would be developed with Māori. And also, I guess the expectation there is that if you really want to understand the impact that something is going to have on a particular group, be they Māori, be they Pacific peoples in New Zealand, be they people with disabilities, be they people from the rainbow community, you need to actually engage them. You need to talk to them. And part of what this is doing is requiring agencies to show that they've gone through a disciplined process of doing this.
That's great. Thank you. Thanks for that explanation. How can an like for the OPC, what will the OPC consider or gauge or look at to understand compliance with the proportionality assessment? What will help an organization prove its compliance or show its compliance if there was ever a question about biometric processing?
So we would look at their proportionality tests. So we'd have a look at their documentation. So it would be very important for them to have completed that test, to have retained good records that allow us to see that they've actually taken a disciplined approach in terms of their balancing. The other thing that we'll be looking at is how they've thought about the safeguards that they can put in place to mitigate against any risks that have been identified. And to help with that, we've also created a definition of privacy risk, which includes 8 types of privacy risks. We often find that agencies think quite narrowly about privacy risk, and so we've actually made it clear that that list of risks include things like the chilling effect that biometric processing for the purposes of surveillance or monitoring or profiling can have in terms of, for example, deterring individuals from exercising protected rights like freedom of expression or movement or the right to protest. We're also focused on things like scope creep, the expansion of the purposes for use of disclosure of the information beyond, what it was originally collected for. So we will look at all of those things and test them in the same way as we do currently. The thing about the New Zealand Privacy Act is that it is very much purpose and context driven. And so we would need to go in and have a look at the particular circumstances for that particular agency.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Technology can have a lot of ranging impacts based on the context. It's not the technology necessarily, it's the context of the use of that technology.
That's right. And I think, as I was saying before we started to record, our focus here is that we know that biometric technologies can be used for great good. They will be used in the future. Individuals will want to use them. There are also risks. We are of the view that this biometric code, assuming that we go ahead with it, will become part of New Zealand's trust infrastructure. And as part of that, sort of that trust ecosystem, that actually should help us achieve the benefits while minimizing some of those downside risks.
Absolutely. I'm gonna ask you if there's anything else in the guidance or in the code, the draft code, that you'd like to highlight before we wrap up. But I also just want to note that we will link to the guidance, to the draft as we post this, and that the OPC is soliciting feedback, any kind of feedback. It doesn't have to be professional. It doesn't have to be detailed. If you have feedback, you're welcome to submit it through the website until May 8th. So we definitely will link to that. But before we wrap up, I'd love to hear, Commissioner, if there's anything else in the code that you want to highlight.
Well, the thing I really did want to highlight was that we haven't had a chance to talk about yet is what we describe as the fair processing limits, where we effectively say some uses of biometric processing are essentially restricted. And so there are 3 processing limits that we're proposing as part of the consultation. The first one is on inferring health information unless you are a health agency. So, so that is basically using biometric information to try and infer that somebody has a particular illness.
Which can happen, right? Like you can process biometric information for one permissible purpose, but maybe there's a secondary data that you find out which relates to someone's health. And so to create safeguards, you're saying, hey, these like secondary incidental information you might gather, let's create safeguards to protect this more delicate information that an individual necessarily maybe didn't even know that they disclosed to an organization.
Exactly. So that's the first of them. The second is around inferring, is a processing limit on emotion recognition and physical state. So that's essentially basically inferring something about somebody's inner state, their emotions, their personality, or their mental state, or their physical state, tiredness, alertness, or attention level. Now, we have said in the case of physical state that we would allow for an exception with respect to detection of fatigue in professional drivers, for example. So there may well be the potential for an exception there. And then the last area is a limit on categorizing people into restricted categories. And the restricted categories are age, align with our Human Rights Act, essentially, here in New Zealand, age, sex, race, ethnicity, disability, and sexual orientation, unless there was an exception applied. And the only exception that we are allowing for at this point in time is age estimation. And there's 2 reasons for this. One is because the research and evaluation suggests that this is probably one of the most robust uses of biometrics for estimation purposes, but also because it could be used to potentially reduce risks in the area of children accessing undesirable online content, for example. So, so that's some of the exceptions. There are our standard exceptions that we have under the Privacy Act that would continue to apply with respect to the Biometrics Code, and that's if it's necessary to prevent or lessen a serious threat to public health or safety or the life or health of an individual. So we're always of the view that privacy does not stand in the way of saving someone's life. And if the information has been collected for statistical or research purposes that are conducted with ethics oversight, ethics approval, those sorts of things, that's a standard exception under our Act. And also if the information is necessary to assist an individual with accessibility.
Yes, yes, I did see that. That's
yeah,
great.
yeah.
And the flag that New Zealand is raising on the reliability of emotion recognition is not, New Zealand is not alone. Other regulators are also raising this flag and saying that there's questionable evidence right now. It's not a forever future block, but for now, there's questionable evidence as to whether it's scientifically reliable. And I think that's an important thing to highlight. So thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Once,
but yeah.
no, please go ahead. Please go ahead.
I was just going to say that the last thing that I might highlight for people is that one of the things we dropped from our first time around when we consulted was we had included for the first time, because it's not part of New Zealand privacy law, consent, a mandatory consent, but we've actually decided to include consent as a privacy safeguard, not a general requirement. Primary reason for that being that when we tested it, we found that we would end up with so many exceptions that would actually erode a consent. And also there's a lot of scholarship now which is pointing to the fact that that particularly in a digital environment, it's not really possible to consent in many cases. So we're still including it as a potential privacy safeguard in areas where, you know, it is possible for you to, in terms of the way that you're using biometrics information to seek consent, but we're not making it a mandatory requirement.
Yeah, I thought that was very reasonable, not to mention consent fatigue and a lot of great scholarship on that as well.
That's
but
right.
I thought it was
what
very
it does mean, but what it does mean is that the real focus of this code is on accountability. It's on the organizations taking accountability for their collection, for their use, as opposed to essentially shifting that burden to the individual.
Absolutely. And that is really truly part of the ethos of CIPL, is pushing for organizational accountability, demonstrable organizational accountability, not just saying that you did it, but also being able to demonstrate it. And that's a central theme in our recent report on biometric technology as well. So thank you so much for that. You've been very generous with your time, Commissioner. One final point, as you said, this is a draft code. There is still going to be a final code, and that final code, the public will have one more time to consult with the OPC on it. Once that's done, is this code live, and does it go into enforcement as soon as it's adopted, or will there be a period for organizations to comply?
There will be a period for organizations to comply, and ordinarily we allow for around 6 months, but that's something that will definitely be allowing organizations to have a say on.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you for your time. Best of luck with this very important and timely consultation. And thank you so much for speaking to us today.
Not at all. Take care. Thank you, Laila.